COVID-19 cases continue to rise in many areas of the country, but there's an aversion to close businesses in Alberta once again. Premier Jason Kenney says many cannot afford another shutdown, so we're taking more of a patchwork approach to the pandemic. Joining me now is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me from Edmonton. Tyler, we're in the midst of a 2-week attempted reset on the case count. Will the limited measures put in place actually work?
Well, that's sort of the big question. About a week ago, a whole bunch of doctors wrote to the premier saying what we need is what they were calling a circuit breaker, sort of a hard, sharp shutdown for about 2 weeks to try and bring these case counts under control. We've had days where there's been more than 1,000 new cases. The premier and the government haven't gone that far. As you said, sort of citing economic reasons, the pressures of a lockdown, things like that. So what we're seeing is lockdowns or closures, I should say, in certain places. So if you go to spin class, or for example, that is closed, whereas a regular gym is still open. There are occupancy limits. The premier's asking people to not, gather in the home. So the criticism is maybe this will work a little bit, maybe this will bring cases down, but is it going to be this hard reset some have called for? And that doesn't seem to be the case. But the premier and the health minister, they've been pretty consistent on this idea that they need to balance the economy with trying to get COVID under control.
NDP leader Rachel Notley is still making noise about the contact tracing app, which the UCP is pretty confident in. But a Globe and Mail report this week shows it was only used to trace 19 cases.
Yeah, that's right. So quite often when the premier or the health minister has been asked about Alberta's response, why they're not doing this, that, and the other thing, they've said, look, we started out with the best contact tracing system in the country. We're the first province to come out with an app. And they've been using this as justification for not joining in on the federal app. And their argument is the federal app doesn't mesh seamlessly with the contact tracing system here. But then, as you say, this Globe and Mail report that says only about 19 cases have really been sort of traced through this app. So there are some lingering issues with it in terms of tech issues and whether or not it could work properly on the background of smartphones and things like that. So it's possible these wrinkles will be ironed out in coming weeks. But yeah, the NDP has been hitting them hard over the last couple of weeks, saying, look, there's obviously problems with this thing. Why don't you just use the federal one? And so far, the province has been resisting that.
Now, the NDP tried and failed to get the Auditor General to appear before a legislative committee to discuss a recent report which found some account errors. Tyler, that includes over $1 million doled out to sole source contracts without justification when it comes to the war room.
Yeah, so the Auditor General put out this report, about $1.5 billion were sort of unaccounted for in the government's finances. The big one that jumped out at people was, as you say, sole source contracts from the Canadian Energy Centre. The War Room has had a rough go of it for the past couple of years. They get criticized left, right, and center no matter what they do. But this was just another example of that the NDP and critics were able to seize on about the way the War Room is operating. And then the other thing that really jumped out at people was folks might remember a change in when AISH payments were doled out. That's the Alberta income support for the severely handicapped. And it turned out that change was basically an accounting gimmick to count only 11 months in the fiscal year instead of a full 12 months. So the Auditor General sort of called out some of these things. The NDP obviously upset, progressive groups obviously upset, but the UCP seems to have defeated that attempt to get the Auditor General to testify. But going forward, the NDP's social channels are talking about fiscal responsibility and things like that. So it's almost one of those things. They say that you can waste $1 million here and there, but if you get caught with the $18 glass of orange juice, you can end up in trouble. So no doubt we're going to see in a couple of years all this stuff coming back around in campaign documents.
Tyler, the province is hoping to speed up economic recovery by setting timelines for municipalities to deal with development permits. How will that work?
Yeah, so they've set sort of 3 hard deadlines of 20, 40, and 60 days in terms of receiving permits, getting back about permits, finally approving permits within about 60 days. The idea to get projects moving faster, get builders working faster, that sort of thing. Now, of course, people will look at that and say, "Oh, well, how on earth would you ever approve a new arena or something like that in 60 days?" So there are still some things that a council can do to try and extend these things where it's needed. But the idea is to get the economy rolling a bit quicker, get construction going quicker. Now the NDP criticizing this, saying that, well, we trust local councillors more than the government, the provincial government, and things like that. But this is one of the red tape reduction things that the government's been going on about for the last couple of years. And again, we talk about this every week, it seems, about how they're still doing all of these governance things in the background, even as the pandemic's going on.
Many people would argue that small to medium businesses are the true backbone of our economy, and the opposition in Alberta is calling for new measures to help small business owners weather the pandemic. What kind of measures?
Yeah, so basically this goes back to what we talked about right at the beginning here with one of the issues with a big long-term shutdown or frankly even a short shutdown is if that's going to happen, either businesses are going to be in a considerable amount of trouble or the government's going to have to put out a bunch of money to support them. So the NDP is calling for a couple things. They want, for example, there is a ban on commercial evictions back in the spring, and that has since lapsed. So they are asking for those rules to be brought back in. They're asking for, a suspension on cutting off utilities and things like that for commercial tenants. Just some things that might make the pandemic a little bit easier to bear for businesses with or without a shutdown. And we're seeing problems with small business all over the province, all over the country. I think at this point, pretty much everyone knows someone who, whether they're a restaurant owner or a contractor. I mean, everyone knows someone who owns a small or medium business and is really looking quite worriedly at the next 6 months or so.
Tyler, I completely agree. I know a few restaurant owners here in town. You have some of the best food around, usually the ma and pa, the little hole in the wall places. And they told me themselves, if they're forced to shut down again for another 2 to 3 months, they're going to have to close their doors permanently. So we have to find a better solution than just shutting down all of these businesses. Our province's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Dina Henshaw, has written to police chiefs asking for help in enforcing the new non-voluntary COVID-19 measures that are in place. The police have said, we prefer education.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine there's a great public relations desire for the police to go and kick down doors on Christmas dinner and things like that. Now, I don't think that's what we're talking about. I think we're talking about the restrictions on serving alcohol later, for example. That was one of the other things I didn't mention off the top. Yeah, as you said, the police are sort of like, well, we'd prefer not to have to do this, but they did say that if there are flagrant violations, repeated violations, then they will step in. They do have mechanisms at their disposal. But it's just, that is another step, I think, to some extent, showing how seriously the government is trying to take this. I mean, if you'd asked people in the summer whether or not they thought police would be shutting down bars because of alcohol hours changing for the pandemic, I even then, I think people would have been surprised by it. So, I think even as people are calling for lockdowns and all these other things, the government, the chief public health officer, they are doing these things that I think suggest they're taking it very, very seriously.
We live in some interesting times right now, don't we?
That we do.
Unions are calling for there to be paid leave brought back for medical workers isolating from COVID-19 and comes amidst fear from the capacity of the healthcare system to handle a further influx of sick people.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, this was Rachel Notley's lead-off question in question period on Wednesday, asking the government to bring this in. The objection is basically that you have people who get sick from COVID-19 who have to self-isolate, and you have people who, in the medical context in particular, who may have been exposed and must isolate sort of pending test results and things like that. And the concern from the unions is that they're having to use their sick banks, their banked up sick days to be off work, and they're calling for more support from the government. As you said, there is this very large concern in hospitals that they are going to be overrun by COVID patients. I mean, people talk about sort of this lag time, that if we're seeing, record-breaking new cases today, in 2 weeks or so, we're going to see more hospitalizations and things like that. And the provincial numbers in terms of ICU occupancy are at about 2/3, maybe even a little bit more right now. So, and I was speaking with a bunch of doctors and nurses this week, and they're saying, look, we're burnt out. The care of patients is dependent on whether or not we have enough staff to be there, whether or not we have the energy to be there. So, there's some of the political stuff in the background on all this, I think, Hal, in terms of the relationship that the medical sector has with the government right now. And so that context, I think, is important here. But on the other hand, I mean, these people are clearly being, worked down to the bone, and it doesn't look like things are going to get much easier for them in the weeks to come.
You know what? I keep hearing a lot about that, about hospitals being potentially overrun, ICU units. I'd actually like to take a lipstick camera, a nice hidden camera, and just kind of walk through the hospital and see if it's actually true. Like for ourselves, actually go in there and see, are there people on gurneys outside of the hospital rooms, and just how busy it really is, right?
There was this interesting phenomenon back in the spring where people weren't going to the hospital. People who, had chest pain or something, instead of going to the ER, they'd stay away, maybe get an appointment with their family doctor. And there was people were bracing for it to be overrun with COVID patients, and then that just didn't really happen because other patients didn't come. And so some of the people I've talked to said that they're seeing a little bit of that, but they had concerns that there's a mortality bump down the road from people who say miss a cancer diagnosis. And they also said, and speaking with some people in the health minister's office, saying that one of the other things that's happening here is this is a busy time of year for hospitals generally. So when we talk about capacity issues, it's not just COVID, but all these other people. You slip and break your arm on the ice or something and have to go to the emergency. So plenty of issues all percolating here. But I think you're very right about that. That especially depending which hospital you go to, whether that's downtown Edmonton or Calgary or a rural hospital or something like that.
More good news for Keystone XL pipeline as TC Energy inked a deal with a coalition of Indigenous groups. Now, Tyler, if Joe Biden does in fact move into the White House in January, would that kind of jeopardize the pipeline and the thousands of jobs it would create?
Well, that's an outstanding issue, that's for sure. Joe Biden had promised that he was going to scrap the Keystone pipeline, but as we talked about a couple weeks ago, TC Energy moved to hire contractors to build some of the U.S. portions of it, and inking this deal with First Nations. So this is, to some extent, it's a little bit of the social license argument, I think, where they can then take this to the president, to the president's advisors, and say, this is the buy-in this project has. Can you really say no to these people? So, I think everyone's kind of worried about that. It's on everyone's mind, I think, but it's just a bit of a waiting game right now to see what happens in January.
Yeah, so much hangs in the balance right now, absolutely. Now, here's kind of an interesting story. The UCP put out a press release that Alberta Premier Jason Kenney rented an RV for his tour of southern Alberta this summer instead of staying in hotels. Hey, just think of all of the money saved taxpayers, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I think the government said they spent about $2,300 on this trip. A couple $100 on gas, a couple grand on renting the RV, and some personal expenses. I'm not sure I would want to be driving around in an RV in the peak of summer. I mean, the government's trying to save money, tighten belts where it can. So if the premier is willing to rough it in a RV for a few days, then good for him. But yeah, the press release just kind of landed in reporters' inboxes, and I thought, well, this is an odd, kind of strange thing to announce. But I read through it and thought, why not? $100 a night to stay in a hotel versus a couple grand for a week in an RV. It makes sense, I suppose.
I think it'd be even cooler if you said, you know what, we're staying at KOA campgrounds. We're going to be tenting it the whole way. Now, that would have been something special to talk about, right?
Would have had to send a reporter along to see if the premier knows how to cook over a fire and things like that.
Oh, there you go, pitching a tent and tearing it down. Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks for joining me today from Edmonton.
My pleasure, Hal.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks for watching.